You're listening to The Reclaimed Life, a podcast about recognizing manipulation, reclaiming your voice, and rebuilding a life that actually feels like your own. I'm Rachel Paxton, an author, ordained chaplain, and certified mental health coach. And each week, I'll explore the patterns, dynamics, and turning points that help people rediscover who they truly are. Welcome to the Reclaim Life podcast. Today I want to talk about why moving on can be so much harder than simply deciding to leave something or someone behind, especially when what we're leaving behind isn't something we stopped loving. Sometimes you're moving on from something you were deeply committed to, something you were loyal to, something you believed in, something that may have been actually good. And that can make the grief much more complicated because you aren't necessarily leaving something you wanted to leave. Sometimes you're leaving something you wanted to keep. You're leaving a future you had imagined, a dream you'd invested yourself in, or a life you thought you were going to live. And when that future disappears, you're not just grieving what happened, you're grieving what you thought was going to happen. And I think that's one of the hardest parts of moving on. People may look at you and think you're refusing to let go, when what you're actually doing is trying to figure out how to live without the future you thought you were going to have. Sometimes you don't want a new dream. You want the dream you already had. You may have spent years building your life around it, making sacrifices for it, defending it, and believing that if you just stayed committed long enough, eventually you would arrive where you thought you were going. So when someone says, you just need to move on, there can be a part of you that wants to say, move on to what? Because you didn't ask for a different life. You were trying to hold on to the one you thought you were building. And eventually, moving on may mean daring to dream again when you don't want to dream again. It may mean standing in a life you didn't choose and slowly beginning to wonder what could still be possible. That's part of why moving on can require so much internal work. You're not simply changing your circumstances, you're having to change the way you think about yourself inside those circumstances. Sometimes you have to rewire ways of thinking that you've lived with for years. Sometimes you have to heal from what prolonged stress and uncertainty have done to you. And sometimes you realize that you may actually have to become a person you've never been before. That doesn't mean there was something wrong with the person you were. It may simply mean that the life you're moving into requires something different from you than the life you're leaving behind did. That can be incredibly disorienting. You may suddenly realize you can't make decisions the way you used to because you no longer want every decision to be based on what other people think. You may stop wanting to look around for approval before trusting your own judgment. You may begin to realize how much of your worth you've been outsourcing to whether other people understand you, approve of you, stay with you, or agree with you. And when you've lived that way for a long time, stopping can feel strangely empty. You can reach a point where you know what everyone else thinks, you know what you're supposed to think, and you even know what you used to think, but you aren't completely sure what you believe anymore. And that can be a very lonely place to stand. And sometimes we mistake that loneliness for failure because we assume that if we're really moving on, we should feel better by now. We should feel free. We should feel certain. We should be excited about the future. But sometimes moving on feels like abandonment long before it feels like freedom. It can feel like you've been left behind, even when you're the one who made the decision. It can feel like betrayal, even when you know in your heart that you aren't betraying anyone. And sometimes other people will tell you that you are. They may call you selfish or disloyal. They may tell you that you've changed. And maybe you have changed. That's part of it. You may actually be becoming someone who no longer makes every decision based on keeping everyone else comfortable, and someone who doesn't keep explaining herself in the hope that eventually everyone will understand. Someone who doesn't spend the rest of her life trying to convince people that she meant well. Someone who's beginning to understand that being misunderstood doesn't necessarily mean she's done something wrong. That kind of change can be painful, especially when the people around you were comfortable with the person you used to be. There's a particular grief in realizing that some people may only understand you as long as you remain familiar to them. Moving on may mean becoming unfamiliar. It may mean leaving behind everything you thought you knew about yourself and walking away from definitions that once gave you a sense of certainty. And sometimes it means standing at the edge of a life you didn't plan and realizing there is no map. I think that's why moving on can feel so much like losing your identity. Because sometimes you aren't just leaving a relationship or a situation, you're leaving a version of yourself that existed inside it, and you don't yet know who you are without it. I've learned that you can't always rush that part. There are things you have to sit with. There are feelings you have to actually feel, thoughts you have to sort through, and beliefs you have to examine. There are losses you have to grieve without immediately trying to turn them into lessons. Sometimes you have to admit that something hurt. Sometimes you have to admit that you miss what you lost. Sometimes you have to admit that you didn't want the ending. And sometimes you have to admit that you're still grieving something you know you can't go back to. None of that means you aren't moving on. It may actually be what moving on looks like. Because moving on isn't forgetting. It isn't pretending you didn't care. And it isn't deciding that what you lost wasn't important. It isn't convincing yourself that you never wanted it in the first place. Sometimes moving on is honoring the fact that you wanted something very much and then choosing to live anyway. I think that's one of the bravest parts. You can love what something meant to you and still let it become part of your past. You can be grateful for what was good without needing it to remain your future. You can grieve a dream without believing that your life is over because that dream didn't come true. And eventually, perhaps very slowly, you begin making decisions that aren't based on getting back what you lost. You begin making decisions based on who you are becoming. That can be frightening, especially if you've spent years trying to fit in, trying to be understood, trying to keep relationships intact, or trying to make sure everyone knows your heart. At some point, moving on may mean deciding you don't have to keep doing that. You don't have to keep explaining. You don't have to keep begging someone to understand. You don't have to keep shrinking yourself so that someone else's understanding of you remains intact. You can simply tell the truth as you know it, and you can keep walking. I think there are seasons when God asks us to move before we understand where we're going, not because we wanted a new life, and not because we were ready for a new dream, but because the life we were living could no longer hold us. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is choose to heal, even when healing means becoming someone we've never been before. Maybe that's why moving on is so hard. Moving on isn't just leaving something behind. Sometimes it's the first time we choose to keep living without knowing exactly who we will be on the other side. There is a strange space between the life you've left and the life you haven't found yet. You may not feel healed. You may not feel free. You may not even feel hopeful. You may simply know that you can't go back, and sometimes that's enough to keep walking. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you're somewhere in that space between what was and what comes next, I hope you can give yourself permission to be there without assuming you're doing something wrong. You don't have to know the whole road. Sometimes you just have to take the next step. Thank you for listening to The Reclaimed Life. If something in this episode resonated with you, you're not alone. Many people are beginning to recognize unhealthy patterns in relationships, systems, and environments, and discovering that reclaiming their voice is possible. In future episodes, I'll explore topics like recognizing manipulation, understanding narcissistic dynamics, rebuilding self-trust, and learning how to create a life that actually feels like your own. If you'd like to explore more of these ideas, you can visit my website at thereclaimedlifepodcast.com, where I share additional writing, resources, and future episodes of the show. Until next time, take a moment to listen to your intuition, trust what you're beginning to see, and remember that reclaiming your life often begins with one honest question. This is The Reclaimed Life.